While technology and transhumanism are huge selling points for the Cyberpunk franchise, another one is the underdog who barks at its master, the urchin who challenges the king. One of the core tenets of the genre has always been high-tech, low-life, and its depictions of the streets have been affected by the impacts of drug culture, technology's progress, the sexual revolution, and the 1980s punk rock scene. Cyberpunk was defined by its core tenets, and the grittiness and edge that were established in the 80s helped define the genre even to this day. Cyberpunk as depicted in the RPG is dystopian, not because it necessarily has to be, but because the underdog perspective needs it to be. Because one of the core concepts of Cyberpunk is to play as the urchin who challenges the king, it becomes important to portray the urchin as victimized by the king's tyranny. In similar vein, the streets of Night City are the results of warring intelligence agencies, uncaring governments, and corporate greed. The more a setting pays attention to the consequences of structural inequality, the more apparent it becomes to the enemies. In Cyberpunk, being low life means that you have a stake in the game. It means that your own actions become justified because your hands are being forced. The more you're oppressed by the ruling class, the more absolved you become of your own sins. To survive in Night City, you need to be both a good guy and a bad guy. Most often you'll be navigating the blurry lines between the two. Despite the fact that the world is clearly made to be dystopian, it also has an alluring quality. Cyberpunk's depiction of high-tech low-life not only paints characters as victims of oppression, but it also liberates them from that oppression. The Night City streets are violent and ruthless, but they're also beaming with expression. People embrace fashion and vices, and they don't care what others think. While people are social creatures, individualism signals independence, and independence signals strength. Despite being oppressed by the ruling class, Cyberpunk allows people to live free. I think that one of the reasons why people are drawn to the Cyberpunk genre is to immerse themselves in liberation and expression, which is highlighted by the contrasting oppression. When it comes to the depiction of low life, Cyberpunk Red focuses on urban and moral decay. The core book mentions how bodies should be lying in the gutters, how wild-eyed lunatics roam the streets, and people's apartments and vehicles are regularly broken into. The urban streets are like a battlefield. The sky is full of hydrocarbons and the ocean is full of sludge. I mentioned how Cyberpunk can be an immersion in liberation and expression, but people rejecting human connection in favor of isolation and individualism also breeds paranoia. The world is dangerous, that much is established, but when things have gone to shit, there's a real fear of betrayal and knives in the back as people only look after themselves. I mentioned this in a video I made on setting design some time ago, but one of the best ways to portray a setting that you want to associate with a particular feeling, like how Cyberpunk Red wants to portray Night City's combat zones as a shithole, is to also present a contrast to that image. In that video I said that the contrast between the Shire and Mordor helps the readers understand Sauron's evil, as well as what is to be lost if he wins. The same goes for a setting like Cyberpunk. In order to let players understand why Night City is a shit place to live, you should present a contrast to that shit show. Distant skyscrapers stand like glittering citadels, and the corpse within them are enjoying luxuries while you're out there standing in someone's puke. This contrast not only shows the players how the streets are bad, but they also show them that the powers that be don't care that the streets remain bad. In fact, they may enjoy their luxuries because the streets remain bad. It is first when the players are becoming aware of this contrasting reality that the setting they are in can start evoking the feeling that you want it to evoke. And once the players start experiencing the negative consequences of this contrasting setting more directly, they will start creating their own villains, even without your input. Cyberpunk Red also puts a lot of emphasis on the possibility of player death. This is where I and R. Talsorian Games diverge a little bit. R. Talsorian Games writes in the core book that you shouldn't be afraid to kill off your player characters. That you should constantly get them in fights, in traps and betrayals. There should be no one that they can trust entirely, and no place should be absolutely safe. You should never let them rest. R. Telsorian Games writes, if they can't handle the pressure, they shouldn't be playing Cyberpunk. Send them back to that nice role-playing game with happy elves and the singing birds. I think that not only is R. Telsorian Games completely off base with this statement, but they are also disrespecting fantasy games as being for people who can't handle pressure. Their focus on the GM not being afraid to kill off their player characters can also give the impression that the GM should put themselves in an antagonistic position rather than in a position as narrative facilitator. In my opinion, presenting a cyberpunk story comes back to the atmosphere and the aforementioned contrast. Putting the player characters in dangerous situations can help to highlight that contrast, to remind them that the world has gone to shit and that they are in the middle of it. But when it comes to storytelling, there's nothing that suggests that the dangers in this game should be inherently more deadly than, for example, the dangers in one of those happy elf games that they were mentioning. As a matter of fact, placing the players in situations designed to relieve the pressure helps to further highlight this contrast. The moment the players feel safe, they can start reflecting over how dangerous the alternative is. By never letting them relieve pressure, the danger becomes the norm and it loses impact. I also think it's completely counterproductive for R. Telsorian Games to state in their book that this is how you play Cyberpunk when the golden rule should be applicable to every game. You play the game as you wish. Showing the players that their characters can die is a good thing to add suspense and present a grittier experience. But portraying the game as if player death is the norm creates an obstacle towards character immersion and investment. Why should I care about this character if they are going to die anyway? In my opinion, R. Telsorian Games should have said that this is how you can play Cyberpunk, instead of stating it as a fact. I see my own GM style as being a narrative facilitator rather than an antagonist. I aim to treat the player characters as protagonists in the story, and I aim to present challenges that feel like challenges, but that also lead to pleasant rewards. I aim to present a game where the players feel like there are actual tangible risks, while at the same time not feeling afraid to invest in their character and dare having long-term ambitions. The players feel like they get more out of the experience, I get to portray more aspects of the cyberpunk setting, and yes, I am still playing cyberpunk and I am in no way playing less cyberpunk because the book's interpretation isn't for me. The streets are still shit, people still betray you, bullets still hurt. But the fact that you actually grow attached to this character of yours and don't expect them to die at any moment makes their potential death, or the grim realities of cyberpunk's dystopian setting, having a much greater impact. When your inevitable death isn't the norm, your potential death becomes more memorable. And in my opinion, the experience will be both better and feel more like cyberpunk because you ultimately end up hurting more now when the stakes have become higher. Sorry, R. Telsorian. I still love you. Hire me. If you want your cyberpunk game to feel diverse and fresh, I recommend experimenting with additional themes that may either complement or contrast the suggested cyberpunk grit. None of these additional themes will contradict cyberpunk setting and system. Instead, they'll provide more options to think about when structuring a campaign. The first theme is action. This theme introduces a conflict incorporating suspense and danger, just like Cyberpunk does, but it places more focus on exciting action sequences. Action often involves risk-taking, and there's a possibility that players in a fairly lethal game avoid risk-taking behavior because of the associated lethality. In this case, you could motivate more risk-taking behavior without necessarily tuning down the lethality by presenting rewards that encourage the risk-taking behavior. One such reward could be a stunt bonus that gives the player a luck point whenever they engage in a particularly cool or over-the-top action sequence. Another theme that often goes hand in hand with action is adventure. By adding this theme to the game, you should encourage exploration and mystery. It's possible to add a sense of adventure to a cyberpunk game without adding the happy elves, by having the players explore metropolitan underbellies, abandoned laboratories, or maybe have them awaken an AI, only to learn that it was disabled for a reason. By incorporating an apocalyptic theme, you would have the players face off against a challenge that has a risk of large-scale, life-changing impact. Maybe they learn that there's a pocket nuke on timer in Night City and they need to find it and disarm it. Apocalyptic games add a sense of urgency to the story. Related to this is the post-apocalyptic theme, which takes place after the disaster has struck. Cyberpunk is post-apocalyptic in a way, because people are still sifting through the debris left in the wake of disaster. If you want to make your Cyberpunk game feel even more post-apocalyptic, put more emphasis on the fact that the players are in a world that is the consequence of disaster. Cyberpunk focuses on man integrating with machine, but the technological surge created more than just cyberware and new gadgets. You could shift your focus towards more of a biopunk theme by adding more emphasis on the negative aspects of biotechnology, such as synthetic organisms, mutations, and evil experiments breaking out from the labs. Another related theme is nanopunk, which shifts the focus more towards the negative aspects of nanotechnology instead. But this is otherwise similar in atmosphere and theme to both biopunk and cyberpunk. There's nothing preventing you from having a mix of cyberpunk, biopunk, and nanopunk in the same story. The crime genre focuses on criminal acts and investigations, and cyberpunk opens up a spectrum of new possibilities for such stories. The core concept of the crime theme is to focus on the investigation itself, with players piecing clues together in order to solve a mystery. This is also related to the mystery genre, with the difference being that the latter often has the answers presented early, such as a closed circle of suspects, and more emphasis is placed on solving the puzzles than chasing after the bad guy. By focusing more on the dystopian theme, you emphasize that cyberpunk setting is violent, dehumanizing, and governed by tyrannical forces. This is an inherent theme in cyberpunk already, but you can highlight it more by shifting the focus more towards questions surrounding politics, economics, and technology, as well as the nature of the human condition. There are options for a more utopian theme to be added to your cyberpunk game as well, by presenting the high-class luxuries as utopian pockets within a larger dystopian world, and then invite the players into these pockets. Feminist sci-fi is a subgenre that includes themes such as gender inequality, sexuality, ethnicity, and economics. It's also known for exploring both stories where there are no traditional patriarchal structures, as well as stories where such structures are intensified. Cyberpunk allows stories on both of those spectrums. The technological and societal shifts could have provided opportunities for challenging structures of oppression, as well as created new tools for oppression, or even entirely new forms of oppression. The way R. Talsorian games present cyberpunk in the book is more aligned with the grimdark theme, in my opinion. By incorporating this into your cyberpunk game, you emphasize ultraviolence and nihilism. No one can be trusted, and everyone is out for themselves. In a grimdark game, you turn up the volume on dystopia and make things so gritty, dark, and amoral that players can get away with atrocious acts without moral responsibility. It's even possible to turn your cyberpunk game into a horror game. This theme is meant to evoke emotions of dread and discomfort, where you depict an eerie atmosphere to get the adrenaline pumping. Horror can be psychological and thrilling, it can be gruesome and violent, but it's also the perfect opportunity to make players sit at the edge of their seats. Perhaps something more unexpected is the idea of mannerpunk. Here you move away from intense and gritty action in favor of human intrigue. In this type of story, the player characters engage in the society they live in, overcoming everyday challenges and competing with others around them. There's nothing preventing you from turning your cyberpunk game into an exercise in community building. You could turn your cyberpunk game into a military sci-fi where the players are soldiers instead of edge runners. Here you play a story focusing on life and active duty, where players are equipped with military weapons and technologies. If the players want more expensive toys to play with than they can easily find in Night City streets, this could be an interesting campaign to play. What about a romance game? Now, role-playing romance can be tricky to get right, and it's not something that will be appropriate for every group. Because of how immersive these types of games can be, it's important that everyone shows that the romance is strictly in character between consenting players and not something to be misinterpreted as real romance between the players themselves. When the game triggers real emotions, it's important that the players are able to rationalize these emotions to avoid having them impact the player's real life. However, if the group is mature enough to be able to handle bringing romance into the game, it can provide a rewarding experience that adds a new level of emotional depth to the story. There are other aspects of a social theme as well, where you're taking a step away from the gritty action for the benefit of an exploration of society as a whole. By adding this element to your Cyberpunk game, you encourage the players to explore and experience society in a way that lets you construct narratives surrounding the different ethical implications associated with that society. This is related to the aforementioned Mannerpunk, but puts more emphasis on the political, economical, ideological and ethical implications of Cyberpunk society. As mentioned, there are many ways to play Cyberpunk, and while I do respect Artels Oran Games for the theme they want to portray, it's their game and their vision, I want with this video show potential players and game masters that there are endless opportunities for Cyberpunk stories, and that I hope that the book's presentation doesn't deter you from exploring the game in your own way. Cyberpunk has a great world and a great system, and while Cyberpunk Red is still fairly new, I did explore Cyberpunk 2020 in many different themes with different levels of grittiness. If you want to play the game the way the book presents it, go for it. But I recommend trying to mix in additional themes and experimenting more with the narrative structure to give yourself more options for diverse stories. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, make sure to do all the things with the clicking and the bells and the sharing and the stuff. If you approached Cyberpunk in unique and different ways, please comment below and share the details. I did present a number of different approaches to Cyberpunk in this video, but I'm interested in learning more about your experiences as well. Anyway, until next time.